During the annihilation of the British Army by the Zulus at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, two British officers, Lieutenants Melvill and Coghill, went down in history as they desperately tried to save the Queen's colour and carry it to safety. But were they really heroes trying to save the colour? Or were they merely trying to save their skins? It's time to uncover the controversies surrounding Melvill and Coghill and the saving of the Queen's colour at the Battle of Isandlwana. I've related the story of the Battle of Isandlwana in my most recent video, so I'm not going to go over that all again. I'll just give you a very quick overview to put this story into context. Having invaded Zululand in January 1879, Lord Chelmsford, the British commander, divided his force into two and set off eastwards to meet the expectant Zulu army, leaving the remainder, approximately 1,700 men, at the camp at Isandlwana, including 700 British regulars from the 24th Regiment of Foot. The Zulus, however, were not to the east. In a brilliant piece of deception and organisation, their army of 25,000 men had bypassed Chelmsford, and on the 22nd of January they launched a highly disciplined and courageous attack on the British garrison at Isandlwana. And again, if you want to hear the exact reasons for what happened next, please watch my video about the battle itself. There's going to be a link at the end of this video, and indeed there's a link in the description below. Whilst the British pinned down the main Zulu attack with volley rifle fire, the Zulu right horn or right wing had successfully moved behind Isandlwana mountain and then charged into the undefended rear of the British camp. Facing disaster, Lieutenant Colonel Pauline from the 24th Foot, whom Lord Chelmsford had left in charge, ordered his troops to fall back on the camp. As the buglers sounded this message, the Zulus in front of them charged en masse. Falling back the half a mile to the camp, the soldiers were surrounded by Zulu warriors who picked them off in small groups. Several companies tried to form squares, keeping the Zulus back with well-disciplined rifle fire, and when the ammunition ran out, they defended themselves with their bayonets and even their bare fists. What had up until that moment been a well-ordered British defence suddenly turned into a chaotic rout. And there was only one escape route left for those defenders: Fugitives Trail. But before we travel down that terrifying trail, let's head back into the pandemonium of the camp for a crucial part of our story, the start of that heroic legend of saving the colours, and also a military controversy. During these last minutes in the camp, Lieutenant Colonel Pauline rode with Lieutenant Melville to the tent housing the Queen's colour of the 1st Battalion, 24th Foot. The colours were the flags of the regiment, and were a very visible rallying point on a battlefield in those days for soldiers. Highly symbolic, there could be no greater dishonour and calamity for an infantry regiment than to lose their colours. Men would quite literally fight to the death to protect them. Actually, infantry regiments had two colours, on either a Cross of St George or on a plain background, traditionally the colour of the lining of their red coat tunics. And then the Queen's colour, or King's colour, depending if you had a king or queen, with the regimental name in the centre of a Union Jack. And at this time, as infantry regiments were numbered rather than having geographic or other names, the name in that gold background was simply the regimental number in Roman numerals, in this case, number 24. And it was the Queen's colour of the 1st Battalion, the 24th Foot Regiment, that Colonel Pauline retrieved from the tent in those last frantic minutes in the camp. For the record, their regimental colour was still with a company in Natal, which was making its way to join Chelmsford's column here at Isandlwana. And both colours of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Foot Regiment were also here at the camp, but in a separate tent, which had already been seized by the Zulus. Pauline handed the Queen's colour to Lieutenant Melville, saying, "You, as senior subaltern, will take the colours and make your way from here." Melville took the sacred colour, saluted his colonel, wheeled his horse away, and joined the throng fleeing the destruction in the camp. Teaming up with Lieutenant Coghill, who was wearing a blue tunic, the two men heroically galloped out of the camp and into Victorian and military legend. Lieutenant Timothy Melville was born in London in 1842. Having been educated at Harrow School and then Cambridge University, he was seen as a rising star in the British Army. Indeed, shortly before the Zulu War, whilst in Cape Town, he had successfully passed the exams to Staff College. Those of you who've watched my video about Field Marshal Sir William Robertson might recall that Staff College was basically like the British Army's university for budding senior staff officers, of whom only 30 from the whole British Army were selected each year. Lieutenant Melville Coghill was born in Drumcondra, now a suburb of Dublin in Ireland, and came from Anglo-Irish aristocracy. An ambitious officer, coming up towards his 27th birthday, he'd actually been serving as aide-de-camp to the British High Commissioner in South Africa, Sir Bartle Frere. But as the war clouds gathered, he'd requested that he return to his regiment, the 24th Foot. And it was with the 24th Foot on the 20th of January, whilst he was actually scouting ahead of the advancing British Army with Lord Chelmsford, that he'd fallen off his horse and had dislocated his kneecap. Hardly able to walk, Coghill had been left in the camp when Chelmsford took half his force east that very morning in search of the Zulus. Now the two officers, Melvill and Coghill, were joining the desperate and terrified throng, running the bloody gauntlet of Fugitives Trail, an escape route that was rapidly turning into a graveyard. Those members of the British garrison trying to escape had to fight their way through the very tips of the two Zulu horns, the left and right horns, that were coming together to snap shut this last means of avoiding the slaughter in the camp. Zulus were peeling away from the horns in pursuit of these fugitives, running in and out of the fleeing mass of troops, spearing them as they went. Whilst some regular units, such as the remnants of F Company of the 1st Battalion, 24th Foot, under Lieutenant Edgar Anstey, tried to remain together and conduct a fighting retreat down that trail, most of those fleeing were simply a disorganised rabble. Mounted colonial soldiers, officers from the artillery whose guns had overturned as they'd retreated pell-mell into the camp, civilian interpreters and wagoners, individual redcoats. Personally, I cannot imagine the sheer terror and physical efforts that must have confronted those men fleeing down this route, hoping to reach safety. It's now known as Fugitives Trail. Now, trail gives the idea it was some sort of path or track. Actually, it was neither. It was 8 miles of broken countryside towards the border of the British colony of Natal. Can you imagine being a British redcoat soldier in a heavy woolen tunic and woolen trousers, wearing steel-shod boots, trying to run 8 miles in the hot African summer? And behind you, you can hear the battle cries of the victorious Zulu warriors, fleet-footed, not weighed down by the woolen uniform, used to this terrain. It didn't take long for those warriors to start to overhaul the fugitives from Isandlwana. And as you're staggering across this broken countryside, every now and then you'd see a Zulu darting towards you out of the corner of your eye, and you'd try and accelerate. Maybe you'd try and take him on with a bullet or a bayonet or the butt of your rifle, if you still had it. Crossing a small stream, passing acacia trees and aloe plants, your hands and face being torn as you stumble through thorn bushes that litter the route. More dry dongas or gullies to climb down into and then climb up the other side, all the time with the Zulus chasing you. Probably no water left to quench your thirst on a day that's remembered by many survivors, both British and Zulu, as eerily hot and still. Even in a normal January day in this part of the world, the average temperature at this time of the day is in the upper 80s Fahrenheit, over 30 degrees centigrade. And all the time, the Zulus are running in and out, stabbing the fleeing throng with their assegais. Men on their horses passing by, injured men lying calling for help, even some frightened camp cattle joining in this rush towards safety. 8 whole miles. Any reserves of adrenaline must have been used up long before they finally looked down from the escarpment onto the border, the Buffalo River. And now the horror continued, gingerly having to pick your way down that steep slope, only to find the river in full flood. Men were now milling around on the bank, trying to work out how and where they were going to cross this flooded river. Even mounted men who were trying to cling on to their horses as they swam across the river were in trouble as those horses hit submerged rocks, or were so exhausted they were just swept down the river. Below a small waterfall, just down the river, 3 horses were just going round and round in circles in the raging waters. Their riders had been washed away. For those who had got this far on foot, it was the end of the line. Utterly exhausted, in heavy clothes, those who tried to cross went under. Many couldn't even swim. And the Zulus were swarming about them, throwing their spears, firing rifles, and running in for the kill. Not a single white soldier or civilian on foot made it across the river that day. In total, just 55 Europeans made it to safety from the Battle of Isandlwana. All of them were on horses. And it was into this terrifying scene that Melvill and Coghill plunged with the Queen's colour. So close to safety, on horses, could they actually save it? Coghill managed to hang on to his horse as it made its way over to cross the river to the bank on the Natal side. Behind him, however, Melville's horse collided with a rock and threw the subaltern into the fast-flowing floodwaters. Still holding on to the colour, Melville was swept towards a large flat rock. Clinging to that rock was an officer from the Natal native contingent, Lieutenant Higginson. Melville shouted to him to help, and Higginson grabbed hold of the pole of the colour. The force of the river and Higginson's weakness now swept the colonial officer back into the waters with Melville. Struggling in the waters, and with Zulus now firing at them from the Zulu bank, the unfolding drama was witnessed by a civilian interpreter named Coghill. As Coghill watched, he saw Coghill spur his horse from the Natal bank back into the raging waters towards Melville and Higginson. And as Coghill's horse swam towards the men, it was shot in the head. 3 men now floundering in the water, somehow they managed to make it to the relative safety of the Natal bank. But looking around, Melville realised he'd lost the colour somewhere in the raging Buffalo River. With the Queen's colour swept away, Melvill, Coghill and Higginson started to climb the steep bank away from the river. But with Coghill's dislocated kneecap, their progress was painfully slow. Higginson recalls that Coghill suddenly shouted, "Here they come!" as 2 armed Zulus appeared beneath them, and then, "I'm done up, I can't go any further." Imploring the officers of the 24th to use their revolvers to slow down their pursuers, Higginson went ahead to try and secure some horses from a group of mounted Basotos who were giving covering fire down to the fugitives in Fugitives Drift. Having successfully obtained the horses, Higginson was descending back to the Melvill and Coghill when he heard the sounds of a fight and a group of Zulus appear from where he'd left the officers. It didn't take a genius to know that Coghill and Melville were now dead, and Higginson turned tail and rode off. But the story was not over yet. As the legend of Melvill and Coghill grew, so did a clamour and a question. Should they both receive a posthumous Victoria Cross? And that in turn created some embarrassing questions about their conduct. In particular, were they saving the colour, or were they simply saving their skins? The British Army at Isandlwana was annihilated, and yet the Zulu victory wasn't total. Chelmsford's force that had gone out east that morning was still intact, and whilst the weary Zulus headed home from their victory, his depleted column withdrew from Zululand, crossing the border into the British Natal at Rorke's Drift. And it was from here that a patrol was sent out to find the bodies of Melvill and Coghill on the 3rd of February. And they were discovered exactly where Higginson had reported he had left them. They were covered in assegai wounds, but both men were still fully clothed and hadn't been disemboweled as was the Zulu custom. And around them lay several dead Zulus. Melvill and Coghill might not have carried the colour to safety, but they had fought to the very bitter end. But in a strange way, they had carried the colour to safety, as you're going to find out in a moment. The following day, the party from Rorke's Drift returned and Coghill and Melville were buried where they'd fallen. The simple funeral service was presided over by Chaplain Smith from Rorke's Drift, who during the defence of the mission station, the Battle of Rorke's Drift, had earned the nickname Ammunition Smith. Melville Coghill was just 3 days short of his 27th birthday. Lieutenant Timothy Melville left a wife, Sarah, and 2 sons, one of whom, Charles Melville, would go on to become a Major General in the New Zealand military forces and serve with them in Gallipoli and on the Western Front during the First World War. As they made their way down to the river, the party spotted a pole sticking out from some rocks, and amazingly, it was the flagpole lost by Melville in the river, and beneath it, heavily eroded from a 2-week submersion in the African waters, was the Queen's colour itself. The Queen's colour of the 1st Battalion, the 24th Regiment of Foot, was, along with the regimental colour, presented to Queen Victoria back in Britain later that year. The Queen placed the silver immortelle on the pike of the colour, which can still be seen, along with both colours, at Brecon Cathedral. For the record, both colours of the 2nd Battalion, which were also at Isandlwana, were never recovered, although towards the end of the war their flagpoles were found in a distant Zulu kraal. The Victorian public lapped up the heroic story of Melvill and Coghill, bravely trying to save the Queen's colour and then each other, especially in the light of the humbling experience that they'd been dealt by the Zulus at Isandlwana. Alphonse de Neuville's epic painting of the men escaping from the carnage of the battle became the official image of their daring ride. But the painting was not an accurate depiction of the event. And that wasn't the only controversy about their heroic ride. Nowadays we tend to accuse filmmakers of embellishing historic stories, for their audiences. Well, in the non-cinema age, painters were depicting scenes as they wanted their audience to see them as well, and also probably reflecting what audiences wanted to see. De Neuville's painting is a case in point. Here we see Melvill and Coghill fighting their way out of the camp, carrying the colour to safety. The problem was that the painter depicts Melvill holding not the Queen's colour, but the regimental colour, which, if you can remember from earlier, was safely in Natal. Furthermore, every witness who saw Melvill during his flight said the colour was not unfurled, as you see in the painting, but was actually in its protective case, which, as Lieutenant Smith Dorian, who saw him at the Buffalo River, reported, was being carried across his saddle. But let's face it, a painting of a man carrying a large container is hardly going to make a heroic and exciting painting. But the painting exposes a far greater controversy, one that raises questions over what really happened, and whether Coghill and maybe Melvill were heroes or potentially cowards. The story of both men riding out of the camp together was recorded in the regimental history, but it seems to be based upon a popular myth that Alphonse de Neuville had captured in his painting. And this myth had started life in a report in a local Natal newspaper shortly after the battle, in a supposed eyewitness account attributed to a gentleman whose testimony can be relied upon. Who was this gentleman? We don't know. But apart from a complete fabrication, there is one possibility. Their commanding officer, Colonel Glynn. He had been with Chelmsford that morning. But why would Glynn make up this story about his officers? Because the alternative would be too hard to bear for their commanding officer, who had just lost so many of his men at Isandlwana, that they had deserted the camp and tried to save their skins. Chelmsford's replacement as Commander-in-Chief, General Wolsey, believed it was absolutely monstrous that Melvill and Coghill had been made heroes, and he wrote, quote, "I do not like the idea of officers escaping on horseback when their men on foot are killed." Not a single witness claimed that Melvill left the camp with Coghill, as depicted in the famous painting. Colonel Glynn's groom, Private Williams, recalls seeing Melvill leaving the camp with the colour, but alone. Lieutenant Henry Curling, an artillery officer, was one of the last men to get out of the camp before the two Zulu horns joined together. Riding as swiftly as he could with the Zulus fast behind him, he caught up Melvill just in front, but he doesn't report seeing Coghill. Another fugitive, Lieutenant Smith Dorian, reported that as he approached a marshy area on the trail, he saw Coghill struggling on a stray horse in the marsh ahead of him, but no mention of Melvill being with him. Not only do witnesses not recall Melvill and Coghill riding together at any stage down Fugitives Trail, but most of them mention catching up with Coghill at some stage. In other words, as they were riding for their lives, he was already in front of them, which means he must have left the camp earlier than people like Lieutenant Curling and Smith Dorian. And that would indicate somewhat embarrassingly that Coghill had left the camp a lot earlier than some of those who were fleeing the final mayhem. Amidst all the heroic stories of survival, there was an uncomfortable truth. The only men who made it to safety that day were men on horses. And here were two regular British Army officers escaping on horseback, while 700 of their regiment were being killed at Isandlwana and along the trail. That gentleman in the Natal newspaper was also the source of the story about Pauline ordering Melvill to carry the colour to safety and the young officer saluting and riding away. But was Melvill actually carrying the colour to safety, or simply using it as an excuse to ride to safety? Or was there another possibility? As I said earlier, the colours were not just symbolic, they were a very practical rallying point. Did Pauline, or maybe Melville acting on his own initiative, take the colour with the intention of trying to organise some sort of stand in the mayhem? If that was his intention, the disintegration of the camp was so swift it might have changed his plans. It's estimated it took about just 30 minutes from when the bugles sounded the retreat to the last organised resistance being overcome by the Zulus in the camp. And with that disintegration, Melville might have realised that the moment to try and make a stand had passed, and a new priority was to save the colour itself. And there's another intriguing possibility concerning Coghill leaving the camp early. Was he fleeing? Or was he actually trying to fetch reinforcements? What we do know is that with a dislocated knee, Coghill was of no use performing any sort of major duties on foot in the camp, whereas he could, with some discomfort, ride a horse. And as things started to get rather too hot for comfort, is it beyond the realms of possibility that Lieutenant Colonel Pauline ordered Coghill to ride towards Rorke's Drift, just 8 miles away, to summon as many guns to the camp as possible? An NNC officer by the name of Young categorically stated that Coghill had been dispatched to fetch reinforcements, and maybe it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Foot, nearly 100 men, were at Rorke's Drift. They were to make it famous that night at the Battle of Rorke's Drift. And 2 companies of the 1st Battalion were supposed to be making their way down from a camp at Helpmacher in Natal to the mission station. For all Pauline knew, they might have already arrived at Rorke's Drift. And 300 extra British troops could have made a big difference at the battle if they'd arrived in time. Or maybe. So maybe Coghill hadn't left the camp with Melville trying to save the colour, but maybe he was on a separate and equally heroic mission. We'll never know. The British press and public preferred to leave those awkward questions about who had left the camp, when they'd left it and why they were leaving it. After the humiliation handed out by the Zulus, all they wanted was some heroes. And 2 young, brave, dashing officers saving the Queen's colour certainly fitted that bill. The cry soon went up that they should be awarded Victoria Crosses. But at that stage in history there was no royal warrant for posthumous VCs. In 1907, however, after considerable lobbying, not least from Melville's widow, Sarah, and Coghill's father, 6 posthumous Victoria Crosses were awarded, including to Lieutenants Timothy Melville and Neville Coghill. Melville for saving the colour, Coghill for trying to save Melville in the river, and sort of by default, the colour too. Both Victoria Crosses are on show in the Regimental Museum at Brecon, well worth a visit. We will never know what really happened as Melville and Coghill rode from the destruction in the camp. Were they acting heroically, or were they saving their skins? There is enough eyewitness evidence to suggest that they did not leave the camp together, as the Victorian painting suggests. What we do know is that when Melville lost his horse in the river and he and Higginson were being swept away, it was Coghill who rode back from the relative safety of the Natal bank which he'd already reached to assist them whilst under fire, which does sound rather strange if his only intention was on saving his own skin. What we also know is that once they reached dry land, Melville stuck with Coghill even though the latter's disability prevented his escape. Chelmsford wrote to the War Office afterwards saying that effectively by sticking with Coghill, Melville had paid the ultimate price. Whatever their motives, Melville carried the Queen's colour all the way to the Buffalo River, and there it was recovered on the 4th of February. So, at the end of the day, the Queen's colour of the 1st Battalion 24th Foot Regiment was indeed saved from the enemy. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope that you enjoyed it and found it interesting. If you did, please give me a like down below and subscribe, hitting the bell icon when you do so you don't miss any of my future videos. Plenty more coming your way, but in the meantime, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.